There is a moment that comes for almost everyone who lives long enough, and it usually arrives quietly, without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. You wake up. The house is silent. There is no alarm to rush toward, no meeting to prepare for, no children asking for breakfast. For the first time in decades, the day belongs entirely to you, and for a strange, unsettling instant, you do not know what to do with it. This is the moment that breaks some people and awakens others. Today we are going to make sure it awakens you. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for those who refuse to let the noise of the modern world drown out the timeless clarity of ancient philosophy. Ancient wisdom for the modern mind, that is our promise to you, and it has never mattered more than it does right now, in this video, for this exact stage of life. If you are new here, we study the lives and words of the great Stoic teachers. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled the known world yet wrote his most honest thoughts. Only for himself, Epictetus, the crippled slave who became one of history's greatest teachers of freedom, and Seneca, the statesman who mastered wealth and power only to discover that neither could buy peace of mind. We take their 2,000-year-old wisdom and we translate it into something you can actually use today in your real life, in your real struggles. So if that sounds like something you need, do us a small favor before we go further. Press that subscribe button, tap the notification bell beside it, and join a community of people who have decided to stop drifting through life and start living it with intention. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. Now let's talk about why you are here. Perhaps you have recently retired, or perhaps retirement is close enough that you can feel its shadow stretching over the coming years. Perhaps you are living alone now, whether by choice, by the passing of a spouse, by distance from grown children, or simply by the way life quietly rearranged itself while you were busy working. Whatever brought you here, you are not the exception. You are part of one of the largest and fastest-growing groups of human beings on the planet. Older adults living independently, navigating a chapter of life that no employer ever trained them for and no school ever taught. Nobody hands you a manual for this. Nobody sits you down at 65 and says, here is how to build a life of meaning when the structure of work disappears and the house grows quiet. The ancient Stoics, however, understood something that modern culture has almost entirely forgotten. They understood that the final third of life is not a decline to be endured. It is the summit to be climbed. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius that most people do not truly begin to live until it is time for them to leave life. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire while his own body slowly failed him, wrote privately about the shortness of time and the urgent need to use whatever remained wisely, not wastefully. Epictetus, who lost his freedom, his mobility, and much of his health, still built one of the richest inner lives in recorded history. These men did not have easy endings. They had honest ones, and what they discovered, we are going to hand to you today, broken down into 10 essential things you need if you are going to live not just comfortably, but powerfully, alone, in your 60s, your 70s, or your 80s. Before we begin, I want to introduce you to 3 people whose stories we will return to throughout this video. Their names are Elena, James, and Marco. Their circumstances are different, but their struggle is the same struggle that so many of you are facing right now. The struggle to build a life of meaning after the world stops assigning you a role. Watch closely, because somewhere in their stories, you may find your own. There is also a myth we need to dismantle before we go any further, because it quietly ruins more retirements than poverty ever does. The myth is this, that living alone in your later years is inherently a tragedy, a diminished version of life, something to be pitied rather than something that can be deliberately built into one of the richest chapters a human being ever experiences. Culture feeds us this story constantly, in the way older people living alone are portrayed on screen, in the careful, pitying tone people sometimes use when they ask how you are managing on your own. Absorb that story long enough, and you will begin to live inside it. waiting for the decline it promises rather than building the life that is actually still entirely available to you. The Stoics rejected this kind of borrowed, unexamined belief completely. They insisted that a person examines every idea handed to them by the crowd and keeps only what survives honest scrutiny. So examine this one closely today, because by the end of this video, I think you will find it does not survive scrutiny at all. Let's begin with the first thing you need, and it is the foundation upon which everything else in this video is built. You need structure, not a rigid, joyless schedule imposed from outside, but a structure you build yourself, deliberately, the way an architect builds a house to withstand a storm. Elena was 68 years old when her husband of 41 years passed away in his sleep. For 4 decades her days had a rhythm that she never had to think about. She woke when he woke. She made coffee while he showered. Their lives were interlocked like 2 gears in the same machine. And when one gear stopped turning, the whole mechanism ceased. For the first 3 months after his death, Elena told us later, she simply drifted. She woke at different times each day. She ate when she remembered to, which was not often enough. She sat in the living room for hours doing nothing at all. Not because she was resting, but because she had lost the architecture that used to hold her days together. Grief was part of it, yes, but something deeper was happening too. She had lost her structure, and without structure time does not feel like a gift. It feels like an ocean with no shore in sight. This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius warned against when he wrote his private reflections. Reminders to himself, really, meant for no one else's eyes. He told himself again and again to rise in the morning and think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to think, to breathe, to enjoy. He did not write this because it came naturally to him. He wrote it because some mornings even an emperor did not want to get out of bed. The difference between a life of quiet decay and a life of quiet power is not the absence of that resistance. It is what you do despite it. Marcus built himself a structure, waking at a set hour, reviewing his responsibilities, writing his thoughts, attending to the business of the empire, and closing his day with reflection. That structure did not restrict his freedom. It created it. Because when the architecture of your day is already decided, you no longer waste your limited willpower deciding what to do next. You simply do it. If you are living alone now, this is the single most important habit you can build, and it costs nothing. Choose a waking time and hold to it, even on the mornings when nothing on the calendar demands it. Build small anchors throughout your day. A set time for movement, a set time for a meal, a set time for something that stimulates your mind, a set time for rest. These anchors do not need to be elaborate. They simply need to exist. Elena's turning point came when a friend suggested something almost embarrassingly simple, to write down the night before 3 things she would do the next day, no matter how small. Make the bed, walk to the corner and back, call one person. That was the whole list some days. But that list gave her mornings a shape again, and within a few months the shape became a life. She told us that the structure did not fill the hole her husband left. Nothing could do that, but it gave her a floor to stand on while she rebuilt everything else. What is fascinating, and what Elena herself pointed out later, is that this idea is not new at all. It is simply the private discipline of a Roman emperor, translated into the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary week. Marcus Aurelius did not have the luxury of drifting through his days either, and he certainly did not always feel like rising to meet his responsibilities. He wrote about that resistance so plainly that it feels startlingly modern. The pull of the blankets, the temptation to simply stay still and let the world wait. What separated him from a man ruled. By that pull was a structure strong enough to carry him through the moments when motivation alone would never have been enough. That is the real function of structure, notice. It is not there for the days you feel inspired. Inspiration needs no scaffolding. Structure exists precisely for the days you do not feel like doing anything at all, and it moves you forward regardless. Build that scaffolding now, while you are reading this, rather than waiting for a crisis to force your hand the way it forced Eleanor's. The second thing you need is closely tied to the first. and it is something the Stoics considered nearly sacred, the discipline of the body. Not vanity, not the chase for youth, but the practical, unglamorous work of keeping the one vessel you have in the best condition. You can manage, for as long as you can manage it. Here is where James enters our story. James spent 38 years as an engineer, a man who solved problems for a living, and took great pride in doing so. When he retired at 70, he assumed the transition would be simple. He had savings. He had his health, more or less. He had, he thought, earned the right to finally rest. So he rested, he sat. He watched television for hours he never used to have the time for. And within 18 months, James told us, he barely recognized his own body. Stares that once meant nothing left him breathless. His doctor delivered a quiet but serious warning about his blood pressure, his weight, his declining strength. James, a man who had spent his career precisely calculating the load-bearing capacity of physical structures, had somehow never applied that same rigor to the structure of his own body. Epictetus, who lived his entire life with a permanently damaged leg, understood something about the body that most people only learn the hard way. He taught that we do not fully control what happens to the body. Illness comes, age comes, injury comes. These are not within our power. But what we do with the body we have, how we care for it, how we discipline it, how we refuse to let it atrophy through neglect, that is entirely within our power. He drew a sharp line between what belongs to us and what does not. And the body's care, moment to moment, day to day, belongs to us completely. For James, the wake-up call became the beginning of something he called, half-jokingly, his second career, except this time the project was himself. He started small, absurdly small by his own admission, a 10-minute walk each morning. Over months, 10 minutes became 30. He added light resistance, work with nothing more than resistance, bands and his own body weight. He paid attention to what he ate, not through some punishing diet, but through simple, consistent choices, more vegetables, less processed food, water, instead of his old habit of sugary drinks throughout the day. Within a year, his doctor's tone had changed entirely. More importantly, James told us, he felt like a man with a future again, rather than a man simply waiting out the clock. If you are in your 60s, 70s, or 80s and living alone, understand this clearly. Your body is the single asset that determines the quality of every other year you have left. It is not vanity to protect it. It is wisdom. You do not need a gym membership or an extreme regimen. You need consistency in small, sustainable movement, a short walk each day, some light strength work to preserve muscle, which becomes increasingly critical as we age, attention to sleep, attention to hydration, and attention to what you put into your body. The Stoics never separated the philosophical life from the physical one. They understood that a mind cannot think clearly, cannot reason well, cannot remain calm under pressure, if the body beneath it is falling apart from neglect. Guard your body the way Marcus Aurelius guarded the borders of Rome, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it protects. There is one more piece of James's story worth sharing here, because it addresses a fear so many people carry silently into their 60s and 70s, the fear that it is simply too late, that the body has already declined too far for any of this effort to matter. James carried that exact fear himself when he began. He was 71, overweight, out of breath, and quietly convinced that his best years of physical capability were permanently behind him. What he discovered, and what a growing body of research on aging confirms again and again, is that the human body remains remarkably responsive to consistent, modest effort at any age. Muscle can still be rebuilt in the 8th and 9th decades of life. Cardiovascular capacity can still improve with regular walking. Balance, so critical to preventing the falls that so often mark the beginning of serious decline, can still be trained and strengthened well into old age. James was not chasing the body he had at 30. He was simply refusing to accept the slow surrender that so many people mistake for an inevitable part of growing older. Within 2 years, he was hiking trails he would not have attempted even in his 60s, not because age had reversed itself, but because neglect, not age, had been the true enemy all along. Before we move to the third thing, I want to ask you something, and I would genuinely like you to answer in the comments below. What is one small physical habit you have built, or want to build, into your daily life right now? Share it. You might be surprised how many people reading your comment decide to start the very same habit tomorrow morning. This channel grows through conversations like that, so do not underestimate the value of typing a few honest words. The third thing you need is purpose, and this is where so many retirements quietly collapse from the inside. You can have the healthiest body and the most disciplined schedule in the world, and still feel utterly hollow if you have nothing pulling you forward. This brings us to Marco, a man who spent 45 years running a small but successful hardware store in his town, a business his own father had started. Marco was 72 when he finally sold the store to a younger couple eager to modernize it. For weeks afterward, he told us, he felt an enormous, almost physical relief. The weight of decades finally set down. But that relief curdled slowly into something else. He would wake in the morning and for a fraction of a second forget that the store no longer needed him. Then the memory would return, and with it a strange grief. Not for the work itself, which had grown tiring in his last years, but for the feeling of being needed, of mattering to something larger than his own daily comfort. Seneca wrote extensively about the emptiness of a life spent merely occupying time rather than using it. He observed that people guard their money and their property fiercely, yet they squander the one truly irreplaceable resource, their time, as though it were endless. For Marco, retirement had solved the problem of time. He suddenly had an abundance of it. But it had not solved the deeper problem of purpose, of having something worth spending that time on. What Marco eventually discovered, and what we want you to understand clearly, is that purpose does not require a job. It does not require a title, a salary, or anyone else's permission. Purpose requires only a direction you have chosen for yourself. Something that pulls you out of bed not because you have to, but because you want to see what happens next. For Marco, that direction turned out to be teaching. He began volunteering 2 afternoons a week at a local trade school, showing teenagers the same practical skills his father had once shown him. How to properly use tools, how to fix rather than replace, how to take pride in careful, honest work. He was not paid for it. He did not need to be. What he received instead was something the Stoics valued far above money, the sense of being useful, of contributing something real to the world around him. Marcus Aurelius, even as emperor, reminded himself constantly that human beings are made for one another, made to work together the way the parts of a body work together, and that a life spent apart from that contribution is a life diminished, no matter how comfortable. If you are retired and living alone, ask yourself honestly, what pulls you forward right now? If the answer is nothing, that is not a life sentence. It is simply an invitation. Purpose in this stage of life rarely announces itself loudly. It is usually found in something quiet, teaching a skill, mentoring a young person, tending a garden that feeds neighbors, volunteering at a place that matters to you, writing down the stories of your own life so they are not lost. The specific form matters far less than the presence of the pull itself. Find something that needs you and let it need you. Marco told us something else. Months after he had settled into his new rhythm at the trade school, something that stayed with us long after he said it. He said that for the first year after selling the store, he had assumed his sadness was about the store itself, about missing the building, the customers, the familiar smell of the place. It was only once he began teaching, again, that he understood his sadness had never really been about the store at all. It had been about the absence of anyone needing him for anything. The store had simply been the vehicle through which people needed him for 45 years. Once he found a new vehicle, the sadness lifted almost entirely. Not because the store came back, but because the deeper need beneath it had finally been answered again. This is worth sitting with, because so many people in this exact stage of life misdiagnose their own grief, assuming they miss the job itself. when what they truly miss is the feeling of mattering to someone beyond themselves. Once you understand that distinction clearly, you realize purpose can be rebuilt in an almost infinite number of forms. The job was never the point. Being needed was always the point. The fourth thing you need is financial simplicity, and I want to be careful here, because this is not a video about investment strategy or retirement planning in the technical sense. It is about something the Stoics understood, far better than most modern financial advisors: the relationship between money and peace of mind. Seneca was, by the standards of his era, an extraordinarily wealthy man, and he wrote with unusual honesty about the trap that wealth can become. He observed that it is not the man who has too little that is poor, but the man who craves more, regardless of how much he already holds. This is not a rejection of financial planning, quite the opposite. The Stoics were deeply practical people. Seneca managed enormous estates. What he rejected was the endless, anxious craving for more that leaves a person feeling poor no matter what their bank balance says. For someone living alone in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, financial simplicity means something very specific and very achievable. It means understanding clearly what you have, understanding clearly what you actually need to live with dignity and comfort, and closing the gap between anxiety and reality through honest, unglamorous planning rather than through avoidance. So many people we have heard from in this community carry a low hum of financial fear for years, not because their situation is actually dire, but because they have never sat down and looked at the full picture clearly. The fear lives in the not knowing far more than it lives in the numbers themselves. If you have not done so recently, take an afternoon, just one afternoon, and write out clearly what income you have, what your essential expenses are, and where the gap or the surplus lies. If you're uncertain about any of it, a single conversation with a trustworthy financial advisor, even one meeting, can dissolve months of quiet anxiety. This is not about becoming wealthy in your later years. It is about achieving what Seneca called sufficiency, the calm, settled knowledge that your needs are met. So your mind is free to focus on things far more valuable than money: your health, your relationships, your purpose. A cluttered financial picture creates a cluttered mind. A clear one, even a modest one, creates room to breathe. Now we arrive at the fifth thing, and this may be the most important idea in this entire video, so I want you to listen closely. You need to understand the difference between solitude and loneliness, because confusing the two is what quietly destroys so many people who live alone in their later years. Epictetus taught something radical for his time and, honestly, radical for our time as well. He taught that being alone is not in itself a misfortune. What matters entirely is what happens inside a person during that aloneness. A person surrounded by a crowd can feel utterly abandoned if their inner life is empty and anxious. A person sitting completely alone in a quiet room can feel entirely at peace if their inner life is rich, ordered, and their own. Loneliness, Epictetus would argue, is not truly about the number of people around you. It is about your relationship with your own mind. Think for a moment about how strange it is that our culture treats a full calendar as the mark of a well-lived life, and an empty one as a quiet tragedy. Under that logic, the busiest person is automatically the happiest, and the person sitting quietly alone in the evening is automatically the saddest. Anyone who has actually lived a full life knows this equation is false. Some of the most anxious, unsettled people carry calendars packed from morning to night, using constant activity as a way to avoid ever sitting still with themselves. And some of the most peaceful people we have met through this channel spend the majority of their evenings in quiet solitude, entirely at ease, because they have done the patient work of making peace with their own minds. The goal is never to eliminate solitude from your life. The goal is to transform your relationship with it so that solitude becomes restoration rather than punishment. This is not a dismissal of the real pain of isolation, and we will address the genuine need for connection in just a moment. But there is a critical distinction to draw first. Solitude, chosen and inhabited well, can become one of the great gifts of this stage of life. So many of us spend decades never having a truly quiet moment, always responding to someone else's demands, a boss, children, a spouse's needs, the endless noise of obligation. For many people entering their 60s, 70s and 80s alone, this may be the very first extended period of genuine solitude they have ever experienced in their adult lives. That solitude can be terrifying if you have never learned to be at peace inside your own mind, or it can become the richest, most honest relationship of your entire life, the relationship with yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly, reminding himself that a person can retreat into no quieter or more untroubled place than their own soul, provided that soul is kept in good order. He was not speaking abstractly. He was, quite literally, an emperor who could never fully escape the crowds, the demands, the endless petitioners and generals and senators, and yet he insisted that true retreat, true peace, was always available internally if a person had done the work of cultivating an orderly inner life. That work looks different for everyone, but it often includes some form of quiet reflection, whether through journaling, through prayer, through meditation, or simply through deliberate, undistracted thought. If you are living alone, the goal is not to escape that aloneness through constant noise, the television always on, the radio always playing, simply to avoid silence. The goal is to slowly, patiently, become someone whose own company you genuinely enjoy. That is not a small thing. That may be the single greatest determinant of whether your later years feel peaceful or unbearable. I want to pause here and ask you directly, because this question matters. When was the last time you sat in complete silence, with no screen, no radio, nothing, for even 10 minutes, simply present with your own thoughts? If the idea makes you uncomfortable, you are not alone, and that discomfort is worth paying attention to rather than avoiding. Tell us in the comments how that feels for you, or whether you have already built a practice of quiet reflection into your life. Your answer might be exactly what someone else reading this needs to hear today. Now, having said all of that about the value of solitude, we must be equally honest about the sixth thing you need, and it stands right alongside solitude rather than against it. You need a small number of deep, genuine relationships, because human beings, no matter how philosophically self-sufficient, are still fundamentally social creatures, and the Stoics never denied this truth. Let's return to Elena for a moment. As her structured days slowly rebuilt her sense of stability after her husband's death, she noticed something else happening, something she had not expected. Her old social circle, built almost entirely around her, husband's colleagues and their shared couple friends, began quietly dissolving. It was not cruelty on anyone's part. It was simply the natural erosion that happens when the connective tissue of a friendship, in this case her husband, disappears. She found herself at 69 having to build friendships almost from scratch, something she had not done since her 20s. Seneca wrote to Lucilius about the extraordinary value of choosing friends with great care, arguing that it is far better to have a small number of true friends than a large crowd of superficial acquaintances. He compared indiscriminate socializing to bad company that gradually corrodes a person's character and peace of mind, while true friendship, chosen deliberately, sustains and elevates a person for life. This distinction matters enormously for anyone rebuilding a social world later in life. The goal is not to accumulate a large calendar of activities and acquaintances. The goal is to find, even if it is only 2 or 3 people, relationships with real depth, real honesty, real mutual care. For Eleanor, this meant something that felt uncomfortable at first, actively seeking out new connection rather than waiting for it to arrive. She joined a small local book club, not because she was especially passionate about the assigned novels, but because she understood correctly that shared regular activity is one of the most reliable paths to genuine friendship. She was patient with herself when early meetings felt awkward. Deep friendship, she reminded herself, is rarely instant. It is built slowly, through repeated small moments of showing up. Within a year, 2 women from that book club had become people she called not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to hear their voices. That is what the Stoics meant by true friendship. Connection built on choice and consistency, not merely proximity. If you are living alone in this stage of life, do not wait passively for connection to find you. It rarely does, especially once the automatic social structures of work and family logistics fall away. Seek out one small recurring point of contact with others, a class, a volunteer group, a religious community if that resonates with you, a regular walking group, anything that puts you in the same room with the same people on a consistent basis. Depth follows repetition, and do not measure your social life by quantity. 2 or 3 people who would answer your call at midnight are worth infinitely more than 50 acquaintances who only know your name. The 7th thing you need is ongoing mental stimulation, the deliberate, continuous exercise of your mind, because a mind left idle does not simply rest. It slowly dims. James, our engineer, discovered this almost by accident during his physical transformation. As he rebuilt his body, he realized something troubling about his mind. For decades, his job had constantly demanded new problems to solve, new systems to understand. In retirement, that demand had simply vanished, and he noticed his thinking had grown, in his own words, sluggish, less sharp than it used to be. This is not an inevitable consequence of aging, though our culture often treats it that way. It is far more often a consequence of disuse. Marcus Aurelius, even while managing an empire, insisted on continuous intellectual engagement, reading philosophy, writing his own reflections, studying the ideas of thinkers who came before him. He treated the mind the way a disciplined athlete treats the body, as something that must be trained deliberately or it will atrophy. For James, rebuilding his mental sharpness became a project as deliberate as rebuilding his physical strength. He started with something simple, teaching himself to read technical material in a field entirely unrelated to his old career, in his case basic astronomy, something he had always found fascinating but never had time to properly study. He set himself small mental challenges, puzzles, strategy games with friends, the deliberate effort of learning enough of a new language to hold a simple conversation. None of this needs to be elaborate or expensive to be effective. What matters is novelty and challenge, activities that force your mind to build new connections rather than simply repeating familiar patterns. Reading a genuinely challenging book rather than only comfortable, familiar material. Learning an instrument, even badly, especially badly, since the struggle itself is what stimulates growth. Engaging in real conversation about real ideas rather than only passive entertainment. The mind, much like the body, follows a simple rule. Use it deliberately and it strengthens. Neglect it and it fades. Do not let retirement become an excuse to stop growing. Some of the sharpest, most vital people we have encountered in this community are in their 80s. And without exception, every one of them has remained a committed, curious learner. We are just past the halfway point of everything we have to share with you today, and if this video has already given you something to think about, even one idea worth carrying into tomorrow, please take a moment right now to hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are searching for exactly this kind of guidance, and it costs you only a second of your time. Now let's continue, because what comes next may be the most emotionally significant part of this entire discussion. The 8th thing you need is perhaps the most difficult one to speak about honestly, and it is this: you need to make peace with your own mortality. This is not a morbid subject, though our culture treats it as one, hiding aging and death behind euphemism and avoidance until the subject becomes almost unspeakable. The Stoics did the opposite. They spoke about death constantly, deliberately, not out of despair, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that confronting mortality honestly is the single most effective way to live fully, rather than merely exist. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself repeatedly to remember that he might leave this life at any moment, and he insisted that this awareness should shape every decision, every word, every action, not with fear, but with urgency and clarity about what actually matters. There is a concept the Stoics called memento mori. Remember that you will die, and it is easy to misunderstand this as bleak or depressing. It is precisely the opposite. When you genuinely internalize that your time is limited, you stop wasting the time you have left on grudges, on petty irritations, on the endless, low-grade anxieties that consume so much of ordinary life. Marco, after leaving his hardware store, told us that his father's death, decades earlier, had taught him something he carried for the rest of his life. His father, in his final weeks, expressed almost no regret about the things he had done. His regrets, nearly all of them, were about the things he had not done, the trip he kept postponing, the words of love he assumed there would always be time to say later. Marco carried that lesson into his own later years like a compass. When he found himself hesitating to reach out to an old estranged friend, hesitating to finally take the trip he had talked about for 30 years, he would remember his father's face in that hospital bed, and the hesitation would dissolve. Seneca wrote something particularly powerful on this subject, observing that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of the time we do have. Most people, he argued, do not begin truly living deliberately, consciously, gratefully, until they realize how little time may remain. You do not need to wait for a health scare or a diagnosis to access that clarity. You can choose right now, today, to hold your remaining years with the seriousness and gratitude they deserve. This does not mean living in constant awareness of death in a way that produces anxiety. It means the opposite, using the awareness of mortality to strip away the trivial and focus entirely on what genuinely matters: your relationships, your growth, your contribution, your peace. Acceptance of mortality done well is not a surrender to fear. It is the doorway to living without fear, because once you have made peace with the ending, nothing along the way can threaten you quite the same way again. The ninth thing you need is a living space that reflects order and peace rather than clutter and chaos. Because the Stoics understood something that modern psychology has only recently caught up to: the state of your physical environment directly shapes the state of your mind. Epictetus lived with almost nothing, by choice as much as circumstance, and taught that our attachment to excessive possessions is itself a form of bondage, tying our peace of mind to things entirely outside our essential control. This is not a call to austerity for its own sake. It is a call to intentionality. Eleanor, in the months after her husband's death, found herself living in a home still full of decades of accumulated belongings, much of it untouched, unused, simply present, taking up physical and mental space. She told us that the clutter began to feel like a physical weight, a house so full of the past that there was no room left to build a present. The process of simplifying her space, room by room over several months, became for her almost a form of therapy. She was careful, and we want to be careful here too. This is not about erasing the memory of a life well lived. She kept what mattered deeply: photographs, a few treasured objects tied to real meaning. But she released what had simply accumulated through inertia: boxes never opened, clothes never worn, furniture that no longer served any purpose beyond occupying space. What she found on the other side of that process was a home that felt, in her words, lighter, a space that reflected the calm, ordered life she was trying to build rather than the chaotic grief she was trying to move beyond. If you are living alone, take a serious look at your living space and ask yourself honestly whether it currently reflects the peace you want to feel, or whether it has quietly become a repository of clutter, obligation, and unprocessed history. You do not need to renovate your entire home. Start small: one drawer, one closet, one room. Create physical order deliberately, because a calm, uncluttered space genuinely supports a calm, uncluttered mind, and at this stage of life, that gift is worth far more than the accumulated possessions taking up space in your closets. The 10th and final thing you need brings us full circle back to where we began, and it is the practice of daily reflection. Marcus Aurelius's private writings, the very ones we have quoted from throughout this video, were never meant for publication. They were his personal practice, written at the end of long, exhausting days. A discipline of reviewing his thoughts, his actions, his failures, and his intentions moving forward. This single habit, more than perhaps any other, is what allowed him to maintain clarity and peace across decades of enormous pressure and responsibility. It cost him nothing but a few quiet minutes each day, and its value was immeasurable. For anyone living alone in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, this practice becomes even more valuable, because it provides something that daily life alone can otherwise lack: a witness to your own experience. You do not need anyone else present to process your day honestly if you have built the habit of reflecting on paper. Each of the three people we have followed throughout this video, Elena, James, and Marco, eventually adopted some version of this same practice. Elena kept a simple evening journal, writing just a few lines each night. One thing she was grateful for, one thing that challenged her, one thing she hoped for tomorrow. James used his journal more analytically, tracking his physical progress, his new mental pursuits, treating his own growth the way he once treated an engineering project. Marco, the least naturally inclined toward writing of the three, simply spoke his reflections aloud each evening, sometimes recording them, sometimes simply sitting with his own thoughts in quiet, deliberate review. The specific method matters far less than the consistency. What matters is that you build, deliberately, a daily habit of stepping back from the immediate rush of the day and asking yourself, honestly, what went well, what did not, and what do I want tomorrow to look like? This single habit ties together everything else we have discussed today: your structure, your health, your purpose, your finances, your solitude, your relationships, your mind, your acceptance of mortality, your living space. Reflection is the thread that weaves all 10 of these things into a coherent, examined life rather than 10 disconnected habits practiced without awareness of their combined power. So let's bring everything together now, because I do not want you to leave this video with 10 separate ideas floating loosely in your mind. I want you to leave with a single, integrated understanding of what a genuinely comfortable, meaningful life alone in your later years actually requires. It requires structure, so your days have shape rather than drift. It requires physical discipline, so your body remains capable of carrying you through the years ahead. It requires purpose, so you have a reason to rise each morning beyond mere habit. It requires financial clarity, so anxiety about money does not silently poison your peace. It requires an understanding of solitude as strength rather than punishment, and simultaneously a small number of deep, genuine relationships to remind you that you are not, in fact, alone in the world. It requires ongoing mental stimulation, so your mind stays sharp and alive rather than dimming through neglect. It requires honest acceptance of mortality, so you live with urgency and gratitude rather than avoidance and fear. It requires a living space that reflects the peace you are trying to build internally. And it requires the daily discipline of reflection, tying every other piece together into a life examined, understood, and deliberately lived. Elena, James, and Marco did not find their way to these 10 things overnight, and neither will you. Elena still has hard days, days when the silence of her house reminds her sharply of what she has lost. James still has mornings when his motivation falters and the couch calls louder than the walking path. Marco still occasionally wonders whether he made the right choice, selling the store his father built. None of them became perfect, unshakable sages simply by applying these Stoic principles. That was never the point, and it was never the promise of Stoicism itself. The Stoics themselves, Marcus, Seneca, Epictetus, were not perfect men either. They struggled constantly, visibly, honestly in their own writings. What set them apart, and what set apart Elena, James, and Marco was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of a framework for meeting that struggle with clarity rather than chaos, with intention rather than drift. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. The years ahead of you, however many they may be, are not a slow decline to be merely endured until the end arrives. They can be, if you choose deliberately to make them so, the richest, clearest, most fully lived years of your entire life. You have, at this stage, something that almost no younger person possesses: decades of accumulated wisdom, perspective earned through real experience, and, often for the first time in your adult life, the freedom to direct your days according to your own genuine values rather than someone else's demands. That is not a small consolation prize for growing older. That is, quite possibly, the greatest gift this stage of life has to offer, if you are willing to receive it with the seriousness it deserves. I want to leave you with one final thought from Marcus Aurelius, a man who understood better than almost anyone in history that a life well lived is not measured by its length but by its depth. He reminded himself that it is not death that a person should fear, but rather never truly beginning to live. Do not let the years ahead of you pass by in quiet drift, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the loneliness to lift on its own, waiting for purpose to arrive uninvited at your door. Build the structure, discipline the body, find the purpose, simplify the finances, embrace the solitude and cultivate the friendships, feed the mind, accept the mortality, order the space, reflect each day. These are not 10 separate burdens to carry. They are 10 doors, and every single one of them is already open to you, right now, exactly as you are, exactly where you are. If this video meant something to you today, if you saw a piece of your own story in Eleanor's rebuilding, in James's transformation, or in Marco's search for purpose, please take just a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this today: a parent, a neighbor, a friend facing this same quiet transition alone. And if you have not yet subscribed to Wisdom of the Stoics, now is the moment, because we release new explorations of ancient wisdom for modern struggles every single week, and this community grows stronger every time someone new decides that the second half of life deserves the same seriousness and intention as the first. Tell us in the comments below which of these 10 things resonates with you most right now, or which one you most need to start building today. We read every single comment, and your words might be exactly what another person scrolling through today needs to see. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Go build the life you actually want to live in the years ahead. Until next time, this has been Wisdom of the Stoics, and we will see you in the next video.